I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. It is freezing out, but in the note, the new novel by author Alafair Burke, it's summertime. Set in the Hamptons, it's a thriller about three female friends and the small but consequential decision they make one night while enjoying a weekend getaway. Alafair, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you write, or you have said that the note grew from a real-life seed, something that actually happened 3 years ago. What was that?
Like the characters in my book, The Note, I was one of three women getting together with friends who lived long distance, but we talk constantly and we see each other a couple times a year at most. And we had a girls' trip over the weekend and we were being silly and someone stole a parking spot from us in a very brazen way. We were not happy about it. We had the universal language of the turn signal, the clicking turn signal, waiting patiently for our spot. That was our real estate. And someone swooped in and took it. And it kind of became a running joke all day long, like what we wanted to do to this person who definitely knew she kind of almost waved at us like, yeah, I just stole your parking spot and I don't care. But we started saying like notes we would write on, like to leave on the car. And it kind of turned into a joke. And we were writing these notes and the waitress started writing notes and the people at the next table started writing notes. And then we started thinking about that's probably a really stupid thing to do, like leave a very triggering note to somebody that might stir up trouble. And the note in the book, that I don't think it's a spoiler, they leave a note on someone's car that says he's cheating on you. He always does, which is just a way to mess with somebody's head. And then that lands them in the middle of a police investigation. And then things happen.
And then things happen.
That's all you can say about a thriller. And then
I know
happen.
It must be so hard to write thrillers and only be able to sort of talk about sort of the bare minimum.
You can just kind of tee it up.
How do you take something that happened in real life and then turn it into a book? Like, do you have a list, a note in your notes app of things that are like, this happened, this happened, this happened. This one seems like it has potential.
It really is a gut feeling because at some point you have to start writing. And for me, I always have a few ideas, kind of just like the setup in my head. And then I also have characters in my head and they're not aligned together initially. Like I might just be thinking about a character who's interesting to me for various reasons. It might be the backstory that's interesting, or it might be a personality trait that's interesting. And then I'll have a setup like three women go on vacation and stir up some nonsense that gets them in trouble. And for me, like when I can start writing is when it's almost like matchmaking of, oh, okay, if I take that character that I've been thinking about with that backstory and that set of anxieties and I put her in this scenario, that's going to get interesting. And so that's usually the starting place for me when I feel like I've got the right character in the right pressure points.
Which character in this book came to you first?
May Hanover is one of the three women came first. I think the idea of these three very different women, they're different socioeconomic backgrounds, they're different races, they grew up in different places. And that's very much me and the two friends that I was with on this trip. And so the idea of a friendship where they're not all the same was interesting to me. But of the three women, May Hanover had already been in my mind. She's half Asian. She was raised by a Chinese immigrant. Her white father really wanted nothing to do with either of them. She's a very high achieving person, but she also puts a lot of pressure on herself to be perfect. Her friends call her like the little sheriff because she's a rule follower. You know, she would be the teacher's pet type, but she's carrying a lot of unrealized resentment beneath the surface. So putting her in a situation where she's suddenly potentially on the wrong side of a police investigation was pretty interesting.
What do you tell your two friends when you say, remember that thing that happened to us? I think we're going to turn that to a book. I'm sorry, this is what happens.
They weren't real happy about it. They were like, it's not us. And I'm like, I promise you the characters are not you. And they both were sort of relieved to be like, okay, no, it's not really us. It's just the setup. I'm like, it's just the setup. But it's the dynamics of the friendship are a little bit us, just in terms of being in each other's business all the time.
One of the things that links the three main characters in the notes is the fact that they have found sort of some kind of internet infamy. Mm-hmm. And the new book is in part about how the internet, the web can make us social pariahs of a sort based on our worst moment or our worst moments. Talk a little bit about why that dynamic was interesting to you.
Yeah, I think I like a lot of us, spent a lot of time on the internet in 2020 when we were all locked up inside our houses. And it seems to me that was around the time when, Karen videos started taking off and, videotaping people having rage attacks on airplanes. Like it's almost become a form of its own entertainment. And these people become, viral sensations for a day or a week or maybe even a month. And it is judging people by their worst moment. And I feel such a guilty pleasure because I will say I watch those videos and, you read the comments and everybody's slamming this person, but it's a real person. And I just kind of started wondering, like, what's it like to see yourself, acting like that? Is there a reflection on, do you justify it? Do you see yourself through other people's eyes? And what is it like to be judged? And it also seems more angrily targeted at women. I mean, it does seem like a lot of those videos involve women who are clearly under anxiety or having mental health episodes in some cases. And it just seems like people pile on to women specifically on social media. And so I thought I had some things to say about that.
What did you have to say?
Well, from a storytelling perspective, I find it interesting because particularly with crime fiction, it used to be the good guys against the bad guys. And more, I think the genre is a richer place because people write stories where nobody's entirely good and no one's entirely bad. It's all situational and we're all human beings. And yet, at the same time, in real life, it seems like, particularly when it comes to judging people online, we either think people are perfect, right? These very curated Instagram stories, or it's like they wake up looking like that and everything they eat is beautiful and every place they go is beautiful and they're always doing good deeds, or they're just demons in the story. And I think putting all three of these women, they kind of fell out of touch, in early adulthood, and what kind of brought them back together is kind of one by one, they each had some high profile thing happen to them that has made them fodder for strangers on the internet. And they've kind of been there for each other to get, to provide some context to each other to realize, hey, this moment will pass. You're not that person that the internet is talking about.
Have you ever been on the receiving end of anything even approaching what the women in this book have to deal with? Not
nearly approaching. It's not a spoiler alert, I don't think, to say that May kind of has a Karen moment and they call her Asian DA Karen, which was kind of fun to write the hashtags for that because it was fictional. And then one of them, her husband was murdered and it's still unsolved and people are convinced she did it. So that definitely has not happened to me.
Yeah.
And then the other one, her personal relationship became internet fodder where people speculate whether it's consensual or not, whether she's, working somebody for power, that kind of thing. So luckily that hasn't happened to me. But people are mean on the internet. I will say, several years ago, I was on book tour and had the pleasure of doing a joint event with Harlan Coben. And for me, that was a big deal. And Nils Lofgren came from the East Street Band and we got a picture taken with him. It was a cool night. And I posted pictures of that saying what a great day of book tour, hung out with Harlan and Nils. And some woman posted in the comments, whoa, maybe you should exercise more on book tour. You've gotten fat, but you're still my favorite chubby author.
What?
Quote, unquote. And I was like, well, that just made me feel really bad. And then, I saw my readers, loyal to a fault, thank you, they start yelling at her. And someone then goes and finds her old MySpace page. You remember MySpace?
Yeah, I remember.
Where she had posed in bikinis, and it turns out, and people started and I just saw how ugly it got so fast. People were like, well, I wouldn't be talking because you look like this. And I was like, whoa, that escalated super quickly. And I wound up deleting all of the comments and closing it off to comments. And I just saw how fast that escalated. And it's she felt free to say this really mean thing to me. As she told me, she still loved me and I was her favorite chubby author. And then people just piled onto her. So I'm like, whoa, I don't want any part of this. And we all see it every day. There's a toxic, vile things people will say to strangers as if they don't read it. It's weird.
I have been making the grimace face emoji this entire time. That sounds...
You have just been like, I want there to be a hole in the ground that you fall into.
It sounds awful. It's amazing, though, because I feel like your relationship with your readers is interesting to me. I was struck by seeing at the end of one of your books, you have a note in which you thanked like dozens and dozens of readers for their comments during the writing of that book. What? There's so many names.
I think it was pages.
It was pages. What is your relationship with your non-insulting fans?
The ones who don't give me dieting advice.
Yeah.
I was encouraged to go on social media really early as a way to connect with readers by a publisher who kind of saw the future that was going to be how books were sold. And I did it really reluctantly because at the time I was a very private person and I sort of kept myself sort of compartmentalized. I'm a law professor. I still am. And, I would be Professor Burke and wear my Professor Burke clothes and use my Professor Burke vocabulary. And then when I was a writer, I was talking about other things. And with my friends, I acted a different way. And with social media, that all kind of you're out there, right? And my friend group was all in one place. It's kind of, if you like Seinfeld references, right? Worlds colliding, worlds are colliding. And that put me in touch with different people. So suddenly I would be talking about true crime with law professors or talking about TV shows with law professors and talking about politics with readers, So I kind of decided if I was going to do it, I was going to do it in a very organic way. And it's going to be real me out there. I'm not a curated persona. And I got to know a lot of readers that way. And I'm somebody who does, like, what do they say? Writing is a solitary activity, but I'm not a solitary person. And so working all day by myself when I couldn't run down the hallway, grab another DA and go get coffee, my social break would be to go on Facebook and I'd be like, hey, I have a character and she's going to a restaurant or something. Like, what should I name the restaurant? And it was just kind of a fun way to involve readers without getting them to actually write the book for me, but just kind of put their little impression on it. And so I started calling those people like my kitchen cabinet. And so I started thanking people, but then it really did get, the one time it was like something like 6 pages. I was like, okay, I've got to stop thanking the kitchen cabinet by individual name. I might have gotten a little carried away.
I'm sure they loved it. I'm sure all of those 92 people just love seeing their name.
I still get people who like come to book signings. They'll be like, I'm an original member of the kitchen cabinet. I'm like, well, thank you. But when you're on book tour, and they've cut back a lot on it. But when I first started doing this 20 years ago, I guess, that was when they'd still send you to 20 cities in 3 weeks. And you're not there with a media escort or a publicist. It's just you and a backpack. And a lot of those readers they were the ones kind of spreading the word locally before I came. They were the ones being the photographers at the time. And it really did feel like I kind of had a team out there waiting to help me on the road. So it was a nice feeling.
It's, as we touched on, it can also be dicey. We live in an age when the internet has made fans feel as if they are owed something, or they maybe have more of a connection to the object of their fandom than is true in reality. Have you ever had any concerns about the ways in which you interact with your readers?
And maybe I think I've got pretty good spidey senses. I can normally tell, if I think someone's expecting something out of the norm. And there've been, a couple times where, you want to be careful when you leave the bookstore and go to your hotel. And, I don't tell people where I stay. I've got kind of boundaries about stuff like that. Like in the bookstore, we'll hang out and then I go home.
Yeah. The note also touches in part, as you alluded to, on sort of our modern true crime obsession. Maybe it's a tiny through line throughout. How the internet has allowed access to information and other obsessive people to make some think that they are actual detectives instead of sort of passing detectives. As a novelist who writes about crime, as someone who is a law professor and used to practice law, how do you get around the fact that this thing that used to be professionalized is now open to everyone?
Yeah, the amateur sleuths online from their basements they're powerful. I mean, they can amass a lot of information. They're able to crowdsource this information that they might get individually from their neighborhood ring cameras, from my brother's a cop and he tells me this, but they can also be very wrong. I mean, there have been times where they put names out, like names of real people who are completely innocent, and then they roll with it. And in the book, I kind of talk about it becoming a form of fan fiction, except that there are real people associated with it and real crime victims. I mean, the recent assassination, right, of a CEO in the middle of New York, and people kind of turned that into an adventure story that they were writing together online.
It also feels connected, tangentially or maybe not, to something like Pizzagate, right? Which is just like people coming up with theories online and sharing them, and that just sort of metastasizes into something that no one can control.
Right. It's a form of a conspiracy theory. I mean, maybe not as dangerous as a political conspiracy theory, but it's taking somebody's murder, often the case, right? Somebody's murder, and then turning it into a form of entertainment. It's well-intentioned by people who might think they're actually helping. But if I were a family member of somebody who had been killed and it became fodder for a message board, I think I'd have very mixed feelings about that.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined this week by Alafair Burke. We're talking about her new book, The Note. Alafair, you grew up as someone who, as I understand it, as a child and young person, just read books. You just read books about mysteries and crime, and you weren't out there trying to solve murders. Tell me about how you became a fan of the books in the space that you now write in.
I think I was trying to solve murders.
Oh, you were?
Actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I grew up in Wichita, Kansas in the late 70s, which was a time when there was an active serial killer called BTK. There's currently a podcast, yet another podcast about him out. And BTK, if you're not familiar with it, he called himself that. It was his self-chosen moniker, and it stood for bind, torture, and kill, which is what he did to victims in Wichita, Kansas. And I remember when we first moved there, they were just announcing that, and I was probably 8 at the time, and a lot of parents would have turned off the TV and said, my kid doesn't need to hear about BTK. But my dad, being my dad, he was like, Pearl, turn the TV off. And we really, like, in our house, we talked about that all the time. We would talk about why there's locks on the basement door, why we check the phone every time we get in the house to make sure the phone lines hadn't been cut. I mean, it was everybody in Wichita was raised that way in the late 70s and 80s. But in our house, my dad, who also likes crime stories and writes crime stories, we were like amateur profilers, and, we had our own version of a true crime message board going on under our roof, where we took the available evidence that, he had left some notes at Wichita State, for example, and he had left some at the library. So my dad's theory was that he was probably a former student at Wichita State. He probably was somebody who wanted to be a police officer because he was kind of toying with the police in this kind of cat and mouse game. And turned out, my dad was pretty close. But yeah, that was our form of entertainment in our house. Like, I was 10 years old talking about who the local serial killer might be.
Do you think if it had been decades later, you could have been someone who was in subreddits and message forums and
I have an account.
And listening to too many podcasts?
Yes, I do. I'm guilty of it. I don't comment, but I definitely lurk. And a lot of times that's where my imagination goes. It's like, well, instead of saying it out loud to strangers, saying, I think this person did this and this is why, that might be a theory that I come up with in my head that lives there until I find the right character for it, for fiction. But to go back to my weird origin story, it was around that time of the BTK being active in Wichita and not being arrested that I started asking my mother, who was a librarian, my personal curator of my literary collection. I kept asking her for more and more mysteries to read. And I think it was me wanting that resolution, wanting, if something really bad can happen in the middle of the book, but then you get an answer at the end,
The BTK killer who operated between 1974 and 1986. He was arrested eventually in 2005. Who reached out to, did you call your dad first or did he call you? How did you share that information?
I think I was teaching. I do remember because he had reemerged. This is now turned into your new favorite true crime podcast, y'all.
We were always going to get there.
He had reemerged and had said, hey, I'm still out here. It's been 30 years. You never caught me. And by the way, I killed some other people you don't know about. And of course, I was following that. And there was false alarm at one point where they executed a search warrant at someone's home who turned out to be innocent. And I was teaching, I was a law professor by then. And even though my students are supposedly not supposed to be on the internet during class, one of them told on himself, like in the middle of class, he like raised his hand and he's like, I know I'm not supposed to be on the internet, but they're executing a search warrant for the BTK right now. And I thought you would want to know. And I'm like, we're going to take a break. I mean, I was that into it. But then when they finally did get the right guy, I think I was probably the one to call my dad because I would have been the one on the internet more.
And how did that feel to have resolution to this thing that brought you together when you were a child?
Obviously, you think about the victims and you think about the fact that there's closure, if there's such a thing, right? But, to have this person be arrested at last and face punishment for it is the way the system is supposed to work. But there was also something kind of profoundly disappointing about it because you want to think that someone who's able to elude, to do the evil things that he did and then to elude the police for 30 years, you want to think that that's some kind of mastermind, right? Like there's something special about them, how they were able to get away with it. And he's just a boring pedestrian guy, like who was seeking power over women. And like, how did he not get caught? Like, it just seems like it shouldn't have taken so long. Not to second guess people, but
we have this wonderful fictional conceit of the genius serial killer. Maybe it's all because of Thomas Harris. Maybe it's because of Hannibal Lecter. Who knows? But I think you're right that these are just regular people who get lucky, who elude capture because of mistakes made by fallible law enforcement officials. And something like that is a reminder that these are just regular guys and they're almost always guys. And
not interesting.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing interesting about that person. And this is not something I talk about very often, but in my eagerness, I think, to know more about it, when he did get arrested, I wrote a letter, not to him, but to his lawyers, because, he had court-appointed attorneys, and I assume they grew up in Wichita, because most people who live in Wichita currently grew up there. And I wrote them, and I was like, I don't know in what form, but I would like to come to Wichita and kind of just observe you doing your work. And I was thinking of it really more as like either a long form article or maybe even a book about being a criminal defense attorney, right? They were probably checking their phone lines too and checking their basement doors. And now they're representing the guy who was our childhood boogeyman. And I thought there is something interesting in that. And one of these days I'd love to hear about that from them. But in any event, the letter was to them. And of course, they're busy criminal defense attorneys. And they're like, I don't know who this lady is. And so they gave my letter to him. And so I got a handwritten letter from the jail from him. And it was very clear that letter had made him feel very important, of like, oh, you're interested in my story and you're so accomplished and I would love to tell you my side of things. And I just remember that the letter ended, your parents must be very proud of you. And there was something like that was so weird about that to me. And I decided at that point, like, and here I am talking about it. I guess I'm talking about the case more than I'm talking about him. He's just not an interesting person.
How, other than surprise, what did getting that letter feel like? Did you regret it? Were you like,
yes, I deeply regretted it. Yeah. I'm like, I don't want to exist in his head. I don't want him to know my name. I don't want him to think I'm interested in him. And to the extent I have written about that and I'm talking about it now, it's not anything that he did that's interesting. It was about the toll that it took on a community. Mm-hmm. I mean, people who are towns like Wichita, Kansas, take pride in being like a good place to raise your family and nice people and a safe place. And the cognitive dissonance that it took to kind of continue to see yourself that way as a community while really horrible things were happening on a pretty regular basis to me was the interesting part.
You went to law school before becoming a novelist. What led you in that direction?
I think I'm a rebel at heart, where a lot of people who are creative people now are like, my parents wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer. My dad wanted me to be a writer and told me my whole life I would be a writer. And I was like, no, I'm going to be a lawyer. No, I mean, I'm being a little bit cynical about that. But I think I wanted stability. I saw what being raised by a writer was like. You know, he wasn't always in print. He worked really hard, and that didn't mean that you necessarily got published. And that kind of seemed like a bummer to me. And I wanted something that was, you know, a good profession that was reliable. And I'm also very interested in the justice system and our courts and institutions. And I still enjoy I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I'm still a law professor, and I really enjoy that life.
So we haven't said your father's name. Your father's the author James Lee Burke, who has written many novels, but readers probably know him for his character Robichaux. What turned you off early on from being a writer? Just like, I need health insurance. Like, this is not.
Oh, I know it sounds so boring. I was like the really practical kid who was like, I was the fourth of four kids. I don't want to say we were poor, but I saw them struggling at the end of the month with the checkbook, like which bill's going to get paid first. And I saw how hard he worked. And, you know, one of the realities of being any kind of artist, if you want to call it that, I mean, you don't have an employer. I mean, you're out hustling. And, you know, he taught at Wichita State, but that's not where his passion was. And I thought, you know, what a frustrating life that you're truly gifted. Everybody says, you know, he is objectively a talented artist and a poet, and to not get recognized. Like, I just saw him like banging his head up against the wall. And so it's kind of funny that I landed. It's probably a reason I still have a job too on top of it. But, you know, I think every writer, if they're being honest, like there's no guarantee. You can write a great book and people might not like it and can't do anything about it.
After going to law school, you became a prosecutor in Portland, Oregon. And then you eventually did that for a while and came over to this side of the country.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my work as a prosecutor, and I should put it in the context of it was in an era where we did community-based prosecution. We were trying to look for alternative avenues from incarceration. So it was kind of, you know, the 1990s version of progressive prosecution, I'd say. And I learned a lot there. But I think what I learned that I continue to draw on in my books and I continue to draw on in the classroom when I teach or when I write as a law professor is that there really is a distinction between, you know, formal law, the way it is supposed to work in the books, and the way it actually works in practice. And my first book, Judgment Calls, which was based in Portland, Oregon, and the main character was an assistant district attorney. My motivation for that book, the idea came from every time I would see a prosecutor show up in a mystery novel, it was always like, hearsay, objection, you need a warrant, and this very technical stuff, and wasn't showing the way that discretionary decisions made outside of the courtroom really are what fuels the criminal justice system. Whether a case gets issued or not really is a matter of whose desk it lands on, who gets the police report, whether a case pleads out or whether it goes to trial and turns into a life sentence. That's all just a single attorney making a discretionary decision. So I kind of wanted to use fiction as a way to put that out there.
So you're saying that the law, which is something that we think operates based on rules that we can all understand, is subject to human whims?
It is human whim.
Is this what you're telling me?
Yes. I call it prosecutorial discretion. But, you know, so many decisions, even like I'll yell at the TV because, you know, some so-and-so is charged with whatever crime. And they'll say, well, they make it seem like it all depends on whether the jury finds them guilty or not. And then if they're guilty, then the maximum sentence is 20 years. I'm like, well, no one's going to jail for 20 years from that. It's not going to go to trial. It's going to plead out. The sentencing guidelines say this. And, you know, all of that stuff that's not formal law. It's just norms that have developed over time.
You are currently a law professor, in addition to being a novelist. What are you teaching your students?
Well, I teach them the rules of criminal law, the rules of criminal procedure. But, you know, I talk a lot about the role of plea bargaining. I talk a about the role of discretion. And, I like to think I'm teaching them to be good lawyers who think about justice and to think about the impact of the law on real people. Yeah, I enjoy my students a lot.
What do they teach you?
Humility. And I talk about going on book tour and people are waiting for me and, excited to get their book signed. They don't find me nearly as interesting. I got to really earn their attention in class. It's good to have a young person's view of the law. So sometimes when I'm cynical about it, to see them really excited to be practitioners, I think reminds me how I felt about the law early on.
You have set your new book in the Hamptons. It's set in the summer, and today it's Tuesday, and it's about 8 degrees outside. What are you doing? Why are you mocking us?
I know. Well, I didn't know it was going to come out when it was 8 degrees, but Maureen Corrigan was very kind to me in the Washington Post with a very nice review that I think of frequently. But it said it's the summer thriller you need now in the middle of winter. So that's my plug for my book, is if you want to feel like you're in the Hamptons, near the beach and it's 75 degrees outside, pick up the book. I do a lot of my writing in the summer. And I do a lot of reading of books on beaches because I love to read on a beach. And so I think my books do tend to I'm trying to think if I've ever written a book when it's cold. I don't think, maybe a few.
Well, we're planting the seed right now. I'd love to guide us towards the end of our conversation here by asking you about a couple crime books, mystery books, thrillers, whatever category you want to use, that you think either you've read the most in your life or have been particularly influential.
I think Mystic River by Dennis Lehane and What the Dead Know by Laura Lippman. I would kind of pair those together.
Tell us about those books.
What's great about them is that they're both stories about things that happened decades ago when people were children, and now in their adult lives, the scars of that and the secrets that were hidden kind of reopen and things happen. Right? That's what gives propulsion to the story. But they're also, both of those books, I think, talk about the toll of crimes upon communities. In Dennis Lehane's case, Boston, and Laura Lippman, of course, who writes about Baltimore so well, they make their cities characters in their books. And so I like to think my work kind of falls into those categories. And then I'm going to put in another book, Presumed Innocent, I think, to me, is a perfect legal thriller. And there's very little technical law in it. It really is about just the impact of the justice system on people and how it can kind of churn you. But he also turns the politics of that DA's office and, the fight for control over that office becomes like a really rich context for the book. And I've read that book so many times. I love it.
How long have you been writing now?
My first book was started in 1999 and came out in 2003, so 22 years.
And what have you gotten better at over that time?
I definitely, in my first book, if you do read it, I think that I felt insecure as a writer, kind of who am I to write a book? I've never taken a writing class, but I thought I knew a lot about the law and I knew a lot about how the law works. And so I think I leaned probably too much into that. And these days, I kind of keep things moving. If I find myself feeling like I'm writing about something that a law professor finds interesting, I stop and ask myself, what does this add to character, plot, or setting? And if it doesn't, I'm keep it in your law professor brain. It doesn't need to go in the book. And I think I'm a little more confident as a storyteller because of that.
Alafair Burke, I'm sure all look forward to your new Winterset series that you're going to start right after you leave the studio here. Thank you for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
That was my conversation with Alafair Burke about her new novel, The Note. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.